Good morning. Today is Wednesday, the 10th of July, 2024, and today we're going to explore the NATO Summit that's being held in Washington today, tomorrow. And I think we're going to start with an article that was written by the Singaporean ambassador, the former Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations, Kishore Mahbubani, who was actually appointed twice as the UN ambassador. Now, he's a very, very well-respected figure, and he wrote in 2021 that the Pacific has no need of the destructive militaristic culture of the Atlantic Alliance. Now, what was he talking about? What he was talking about was the fact that NATO, which has existed since post-World War II and the Cold War era, basically has been involved in invasions and wars in Europe, in the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, and other places. And now the United States wants NATO to be dragged in to Asia. Now, the United States had tried many years ago to set up the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization as a sort of model, or a NATO model, and that failed miserably. And the reason it failed was very simple, was because the Indonesians and their partners in Southeast Asia set up a bloc. And remember, this was at the time of the Vietnam War. And they set up a bloc which is called ASEAN, which has been extraordinarily successful. And that bloc was set up to stop great power interference in Southeast Asian affairs. Now, to a large degree, that has worked. But what we can see is that the United States has, and especially in relation to Japan, that relationship with Japan, has set about to try and split ASEAN. So while it talks about ASEAN centrality, what it's really doing is, of course, is trying to split ASEAN into maritime and continental groups. And one has to remember that the United States has always been a maritime power. So always at the periphery of Asia, the periphery of Eurasia. And it was only after World War II that the United States really had any influence, continental influence, at all in relation to Eurasia. And so NATO began a slow but steady expansion eastward. And so that one can see that that's especially true after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, it's many scholars, diplomats, politicians, commentators and contributors to all sorts of publications around the world have verified this fact that it's NATO expansion in Europe that has led to the insecurity of Russia and trying to turn Ukraine, which was always functionally the great borderland, the great transit zone, that gave Russia a certain amount of security. So it didn't have a very large military bloc moving closer and closer to its border. Now, the same thing has been going on in the Western Pacific for a very long time, also, of course, led by the United States. And that, of course, is the sort of ongoing colonization, if you like, of Taiwan, even though there's arrangements in place, the one China policy, recognition that there is only one China, for example, and this is recognized by, I think, almost all countries in the world, except for just a couple of little micro-states in the Pacific, Paraguay, and a couple of others, the Vatican City, for example. But, for all intents and purposes, Taiwan and China are the same thing for all countries in the world today, all members of the United Nations of any significance at all. And so this hypocrisy that it continues and is, broadcast in Western media every day that Taiwan is being attacked or is being threatened by China, when they recognize that it is part of China. This is just a foolish kind of a statement, and it always amazes me that people actually start talking about it as if Taiwan was an independent country, but it's not. It's not recognized by anybody. So it's part of China, and it's always been part of China, and it will always be part of China as far as the Chinese are concerned. And so this attempt by the Americans to establish NATO in the Pacific is really very much a mirror of what they've been doing in Europe. And of course the great hope is that the great hope was to the statements at the beginning when NATO was expanding, that Russia would be brought to its knees, etc., and fragmented and broken up. And this is what the new foreign minister for the EU, who's appointed, not elected, by the way, Callas, is that's what she's saying, is Russia needs to be broken up. And so the Americans have always had this in mind, and anybody who knows just a little bit about their history will know that the Americans were trying to do that as early as in the post World War I period. They were trying to do that, and they've been trying to do it forever. And now the same applies to China. Now the reason is very simple. Both Russia and China are able to sustain complete supply chains. In other words, their industrial base, their food base, their geographical space is able to support and sustain complete supply chains. They do not absolutely need to import critical components or food if they don't have to. The fact that they do is not the point. The point is that they have the possibility, the potential, proven potential, to maintain these supply chains. And of course the United States doesn't. And there's a reason why the United States does not have complete supply chains, even though it's self-sufficient in food, but it's not self-sufficient in manufacturing. And it's not self-sufficient in minerals, actually. But the reason is because of the alliance network. So to keep its allies happy, the United States needs to maintain its exorbitant privilege of the dollar, and to be able to import goods from all of its allies. So that basically means Japan and Germany being the two biggest. And that sustains their economies. And this is true for the United Kingdom, this is true for Korea. Even though China is those countries' largest trading partners, the key to the alliance structure that the US has built is its ability to keep importing with the dollar reserve currency, manufactured imports from those countries, from Japan and Germany. Now, what we can see is that is a problem because A, the United States is running massive deficits. B, the dollar de-dollarization, if you like, is continuing slowly but surely, and the BRICS, for example, is making that happen a lot faster. So the United States is in a very, very strange predicament whereby it must sustain dollar hegemony to sustain its alliance network and be able to import manufactured goods from its alliance partners, Japan, Korea, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and so forth. Now, what's been going on in the recent past, of course, is that the United States is now hollowing out the economies. So, for example, splitting Germany from cheap Russian energy has caused recession in Europe. Japan has been, ever since the Plaza Accords in 1987, Japan has been basically stagnant. Now, Japan is now the most indebted nation in the world. Nobody talks about a US debt trap, but that's basically what it's in. So Japan is also stuck in this situation. So the US is basically in a situation where it has to maintain these relationships, must import manufactured goods from those countries and from China as well. But at the same time, to do that, it's hollowing out their economies because it can't just import everything, because that would completely destroy the US manufacturing base. And of course, this is why all this pressure is on China, because to maintain imports from Germany, for example, 75% of German auto production is exported. Now, of course, a lot of that is into Europe and other places, into China and other places like that. But that is overcapacity at the maximum, far, far greater than what China is doing right now as a percentage of its exports. So to maintain that and to maintain its own industrial base, it's had to put limits on German exports, Korean exports, Japanese exports, and of course the Trump administration most famously did that, put limits on that again, and caused a lot of kerfuffle. But then one needs to remember that the Republicans are always protectionist and the Democrats are almost always more aggressive and belligerent if one looks at sort of history of the last 100 years, you see the Democrats are the ones that basically start wars. And maintain them. And that includes, all the wars that we're going to talk about today. So in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Ukraine, in Yugoslavia, in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. The exception, of course, the war on terror, which was basically started in 2001 by the Bush Junior administration. But remember that Clinton in 1997 had gone into Yugoslavia, and things had started to unfurl from there on. And so basically, I'm not going to say it was inevitable, but it was definitely a sign that there was going to be greater problems. And that was the first step in destabilizing Europe, Yugoslavia, and Clinton's policy of democratization. Taking out the military dictatorship in Taiwan and Korea, and putting in democratic processes, which was supposed to sort of strengthen them, because the Americans, of course, have declining capacity to maintain their alliances through economic power. On the other hand, what we see in the world today is that China's economic power is substantially larger, especially when measured in PPP, but China does not maintain alliances, although some would say that its arrangement with Russia is an alliance, but it's not a military alliance. It's still very much related to one of the longest borders in the world, and Russian stability means Chinese stability along that very long border. And so it's in China's interest, of course, to keep that working. And one needs to understand also that the Belt and Road Initiative, which really was a westward expansion for trade, was really in many ways because the Americans were blocking expansion in the Pacific for Chinese trade and for infrastructure. And so China really was left with very little choice but to do that. Now all of this together has been turned into the United States becoming more and more panicked about the fact that its economy is being hollowed out. And it really is purely a fiscal military state. I mean, it's all financial instruments. And we can see that debt in the United States is at unimaginable levels. It is so high that I think, and many commentators believe, that it will never be able to be paid back, ever. The only way that this can sort of disappear is it just be inflated away. And of course, that's what's happening. Inflation is still running in America at above 2 to 3%. And they're not able to sustain the import requirements for the economies in their alliance network. So what are they doing? What they're doing is pumping money into arms sales and into warfare. So this is what NATO does best. And in fact, NATO, a little history right now, let's just go back and say, well, what has NATO been doing? And of course, after World War II, Churchill had said an iron curtain has descended across Europe. And everybody took that to mean that the Soviets had put an iron curtain there. But actually it wasn't the Soviets that did that. It was, of course, the Americans and the English who invented or imagined this iron curtain. And the reason was that they were very scared about the Russians, because it was the Russians that had done most of the work to defeat Nazi Germany. It was Russia that paid the very highest price. It was Russia's economy and people that suffered the most. 27 million dead, as opposed to, I think it was 800,000 Americans. So you understand the calamity of that. And in China too, more than 20 million dead from the Japanese invasion of an occupation of China. And it was China's fight against Japan that kept most of the Japanese army occupied in China and allowed the Americans to island hop and finally drop nuclear weapons, which one could argue they didn't need to do, on Japan. And since then, Japan has been a client state, and in all of that time it's been run by the Liberal Party of Japan, except for a very short interregnum about 10 years ago when the Democrats took control, but then became very, very friendly with China, and of course were kicked out of office with US involvement, interference in those elections, to maintain that liberal right-wing conservative and realist view that China was a threat. But China's only real threat has been the fact that it, as I said before, that it is only one of the two countries in the world that has complete supply chains. And this has been proven with electric vehicles for most recently, but also with computing and chips, semiconductors and so forth. It can produce everything. And it has spent 30 years in the most remarkable development that history has ever seen to pull almost 800 million people out of poverty. Now that has never been done before, and it was done peaceably. So one needs to ask the question, why is NATO saying that China is a threat? Now, this brings us to the question of, why is China or Russia a threat? And why does NATO need to exist? And the answer is very simple. The threat is to US primacy. Because the US economy has been hollowed out to maintain its alliance networks, because the US economy has been hollowed out to maintain a bloated military that it can no longer afford, that the United States is not going to get involved in a war on the ground in Asia, because every time it has, it's been pushed back. But one should remember that it has achieved goals, and those goals were always to partition a country first. And this is what it successfully did after World War II with Vietnam, and then it put in a client regime, and then it did the same thing in Korea. When the Russians left the north of Korea, the Americans did not leave the south, thinking that they would be able to overthrow the north. And remember that the north was where all of the anti-Japanese fighters were based and supported by China and Russia to push the Japanese out. And so they'd been fighting war since Japan had been in Manchuria in the 1930s. So that war had been going on for a very long time. And so what they wanted to do, of course, was reunify their country and kick the Americans out. Well, of course, the Americans are still in South Korea. And the Americans are still in Japan. Yeah. But they were taken out of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party of Vietnam were successful in pushing the Americans out of Vietnam with the support of China and Russia, of course. Now, the same thing is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine has been effectively partitioned. By trying to get it into NATO, what has the US actually achieved? And the answer is it's been partitioned. So the Russians are going to go up to the Dnieper, up to Kiev, and then of course Ukraine will collapse and it'll be split into two. And we can see that moves are happening already with a no-fly zone being established by the Poles, or trying to establish a no-fly zone in the west of the Ukraine. And this is the establishment of a partitioned, east-west partition of the Ukraine. And what one needs to remember, in international relations, and I'm an international relations scholar, is that wherever there's combat, wherever there's conflict, there's an absence of power. There's a black hole, if you like, a vacuum of power. And so that's really what's happening in the Ukraine. There's a vacuum. And then what we need to do is we need to lay over that what's been happening in the global economy. And what we see is that global wealth and power, so the combined economies of Eurasia, that wealth and power has moved from the Atlantic, where it was in the post-World War II period. But ever since the end of World War II, it has slowly been moving across, and then that sort of accelerated enormously with the development of East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so now one can say that the center of wealth and power is really a line that goes through the Ukraine and down into Israel, Eastern Mediterranean and Gaza. This is where the real center of wealth and power is now, where there are two power vacuums right there. Now, there is no power vacuum in the east of China, in the Western Pacific. Taiwan is effectively, in real terms, completely dependent on mainland China. 75% of its economy, in real terms, is already integrated into the mainland economy. And China has demonstrated very recently that, of course, it can maintain a protective deterrent ability around the island to deter American Navy or air or missiles or whatever. It can maintain that at will. And that's what it's done. And one needs to understand that as deterrence. It's deterrence of NATO. It's deterrence of the United States and its allies, most importantly of Japan. And one needs to also remember that the Japanese are in great fear of retribution for the acts that they committed against China during World War II and before World War II. A brutal, cruel occupation and war in China that very few people really remember, especially in the West. This is really brushed over by the narrative of US media and European media. And this is true also of Russia. And so NATO is the kind of beneficiary of all of this, well, I'll call it propaganda, this narrative that the Americans have saved Europe or that they saved Asia. And of course that's not what happened at all. They came in very late in World War I to save Europe. They came in late into World War II, both in Europe and in the Pacific, when the hardest parts had already been fought, when the war was already switching, when the Soviets had already gained the upper hand, when the Chinese had already gained the upper hand against the Japanese, and the Japanese were being overwhelmed in the Pacific and in China. It was only then that the Americans came in. And so this sort of logic of maritime peripheral power being exerted to save everybody and deliver freedom and democracy is not that at all. I mean, what's happened really, of course, is that the United States has become the most profound source of global instability. And that's a direct quote from the former head, long-term president, Richard H. Huss, of the Council on Foreign Relations based in Washington on the day that he resigned after 20 years. And what we see is that the United States now has some democratic processes at home, but one needs to, a choice between a senile old man, Biden, who's just falling apart, the straw man, literally the straw man, or Donald Trump, the tin man. Really, click your heels and go home. And I think that's basically what the United States needs to do, is it needs to click its heels and go home. NATO, setting up this NATO into Asia, this idea that we are now the world is going to be split into two camps, autocracy and democracy camps. I mean, so the United States has relations and works with lots and lots of countries that are not modelled on the United States. One has to remember that the United States model, the Republican model, is relatively new and not really tried and tested at all. It only operates in one country, and that's the United States. Nobody has copied their system. Nobody. Most of Europe still remains in monarchies with democratic processes, but their system is actually monarchies, or in the French presidential republican. But it's very, very similar. It's still very much the hierarchy of monarchy. So NATO is going to rescue us all from what? So yeah, look, the thing here is that extending NATO into the Pacific is literally trying to turn it into a conflict zone. Now, there is no conflict in the Pacific at this time, but if NATO's history in Europe is any sign, any indication, then we can expect that the establishment of NATO in the Pacific is also the establishment or laying the path towards conflict. Now, I think history also tells us that the idea that the United States could maintain a war, a territorial war, a land war in Asia, I think it's impossible. From the very outset, I wrote widely and spoke widely about the idea that anybody who thought that the Ukraine in any way could defeat Russia was out of their minds, literally out of their minds. It's an existential threat for Russia, and that was made very clear by NATO and very clear by the United States early on. So, and we can see what's transpired. Now, the only reason to keep this maintained at this point in time is so that the Americans have their enemy and they can get to their November elections. Now, one has to wonder what's going to happen to the US economy by then. Their stock market is at an all-time high as of today, according to Bloomberg this morning. It's a house of cards. There are deep structural economic problems in the United States. And I think printing money is not really going to help keep that going. So I think it's looking very, very shaky. And so this is the resort, the final resort. Okay, let's just go to militarization. Why? Because we can use that as a fiscal quantitative easing. We just pump more money into our military and it keeps our manufacturing going. So this is why the war in Ukraine is important, keeping that going. And so why, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, militarization enables the governments to pump money into their economies, to keep their manufacturing industrial base going, because they can't export anything else. What are they going to export? So Japanese exports are falling. Even though their currency has declined enormously against the US, exports are still dropping. Now Germany too, exports dropping. So all of Europe's in recession. Let's be real. And so is Japan. The Philippines is a particularly unsuccessful economy. It underperforms, consistently underperforms. And I think the rest of Asia are looking at that, thinking, well, why the hell would they maintain this relationship that they have with the United States, and obviously clearly being manipulated by the Americans to create tension in the South China Sea. But then one has to ask the question: why are the Americans in the South China Sea? They are not a party to UNCLOS. It was their idea to extend all these borders out to 300 kilometres, seas, economic zones out to 3, and that created enormous problems for everybody, because it created new conflict areas, new points of irritation for every nation in the world. Suddenly, where they didn't have that problem, suddenly they had a problem. And so a lot of these have been resolved, but the United States has never ratified UNCLOS, and they don't belong to UNCLOS. So the idea that they're operating under UNCLOS is just a mirage. What they're doing is they're saying that they have to maintain international navigation. Well, nobody ever stopped them from doing such a thing. But what they're talking about now, of course, is the fact that that China has demonstrated its capability to be able to deter that. Because remember, no matter what you might think about it, the United States is operating 10,000 kilometers away from California. It's not operating in its home territories, in its home waters. It is operating in the near waters of all the other countries that it says are threats. Well, what are they threats to? They're threats to US primacy, maritime primacy, not land military primacy. And I think we can see that clearly in the situation that happened in Central Asia, where when the US finally pulled out of Afghanistan, for the first time in 300 years, there were no foreign forces, basically all the way from Vladivostok, from Vladivostok in Russia, or even, let's say, Shanghai in China, all the way to Sevastopol. No foreign forces in all of those countries, which is, in large part, that meant that the area has become far more stable than it was in the post-Soviet collapse era. And those countries are now benefiting enormously from the trade networks, the infrastructure trade networks that were built by China. And of course, Russia has been a very key part of that. And the Ukraine was a key part of that as well. And this is why the Ukraine was targeted for partition, because it enabled, the Ukraine was the great transit zone, the great buffer zone between East and West. Or not even really West, because Central Europe, I think, has become the more important part of Europe. And anybody with an idea about Roman history will always know that the West was always the poorer part. It was always the East that was richer. And this is true today. And why is that? It's because they don't have the minerals and the energy and the resources that the East had. And this has now become very obvious with Germany and France, with Germany being cut off from Russian energy, something that they'd done for 30 years because of the problems with the Suez. Now that brings us to the idea of Suez. What's going on in the Red Sea? Well, the Red Sea has now become a BRICS plus lake. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates now embrace the Red Sea. And we can see that the conflict in Gaza, with Israel and Gaza, is about making sure Gaza, why does Gaza need to be destroyed? Because Gaza could operate as a port on the eastern Mediterranean and have access to the Suez Canal. Why are the Houthis in Yemen so important? Well, because they also guard the exit into the Indian Ocean of the Red Sea. And so this is why, but the BRICS Plus has embraced the Red Sea. And so this is why we see this struggle going on, and why the United States keeps supporting Israel in Gaza, is because Gaza needs to be destroyed so that there's no possibility of a Palestinian, or even a, let's say, I don't want to say this really, but a Muslim state running an active port connection into the eastern Mediterranean and into the Red Sea. Because if one understands what the Belt and Road is and the global infrastructure development, the only part of the terrestrial land routes, the land routes that are not connected in the Belt and Road, every other part has been done, is the part to Africa. And there's only two parts that have not connected, and that is Iraq and Syria, right on their borders. And so where are US troops still based? Exactly, right on the border of Iraq and Syria, destabilizing those two places and ensuring that that last part of the final land route cannot be connected to the parts that are in Jordan and Israel, Haifa, that have already been connected. And so this is why the United States maintains its troops there, and this is why Gaza needs to be destroyed, because that would give a non-Western, a non-Israeli port on the eastern Mediterranean, other than Syria, of course, and Turkey, and enable more and closer access for Suez and for the Red Sea. And it basically would mean that the United States would no longer control access anywhere in relation to the Red Sea. And so this formula is also true for the Malacca Strait. Why is the South China Sea so important to the Americans? Of course, because of maritime control of trade. It's not about their own trade. It's not about the trade even of, the trade that they import. It's not really even about that. It's about being able to, what they've done is they've appropriated the security of China and ASEAN and Korea, so that maritime security is appropriated by the Americans. But China has now demonstrated that it can actually actively protect its own maritime near waters and its trade routes in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. And this is what's putting fear into the Washington. They see hegemony slipping away, because their hegemony is based in control of maritime routes, just like the British were when the British defeated the French many times at sea, and France was only limited to being a continental power. But now this is what's happening to the United States. And there are obvious reasons that I've explained earlier, that they don't have supply chains, complete supply chains, because they are dependent on Germany and Japan, European partners, Korea and other partners for their supply chains, because that's what holds their alliance together. Why would Japan and Korea need them, the United States, if it wasn't for the export markets? That's all they need it for. China's not going in any way, and it never has in all of its history, invaded Japan. The Mongols, on the other hand, tried a couple of times but failed miserably. I don't think anybody in their right mind is going to do that. But Japan sees that it's going to become peripheral to the continental power of Eurasia, and Korea also. And Korea has, in all of its history, Korea has always been the kind of the middle transit border zone between China, the continental, and Japan, the island. And so this is what we need to look at and understand in relation to the Ukraine. It too is this situation. So these areas where there are conflict and tension are fundamentally only vacuums of power. And they're being maintained by the Americans so that it has an excuse to maintain its naval and other power, military hard power, to control those areas. So that's the first thing. So NATO represents the final opportunity, if you like, or the final attempt by the Americans to build a military alliance that could possibly counteract the growing power of Eurasia as they all work together in Eurasia: ASEAN, China, Russia, Central Asia, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, all working together in these new arrangements, multilateral arrangements. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which guarantees the security and stability inside Central Asia. ASEAN, which guarantees the security for Southeast Asia. China, which guarantees its own security, of course. Russia, which has shown effectively that it can guarantee its own security. The North African states, which have finally started to throw off the yoke of French imperialism and colonialism, which stripped them and turned them into the poorest countries. I mean, really, the bottom 3 or 4 poorest countries in the world. And where did all that gold and uranium come from? Exactly, those countries. So this is what the Americans are really worried about, of course. They are slowly but surely being pushed back to the Atlantic on one side. And on the other side, they are also eventually being pushed back to Hawaii, which, of course, Hawaii has an independence movement, and I think there'd be real worries in Washington if China was to go there and start saying that it was an independent country and not recognized. That would cause all sorts of grief, but I think that this last throw of the dice to maintain hegemony is unraveling, and we can see that the structural, so as I explained before, to maintain its alliance networks, the Americans have hollowed out their own economy to maintain the military. And then now they're hollowing out their partners that export manufacturing to them, which has undermined their fiscal economy and monetary economy. So it's turned into a purely service and financial economy with very, very small manufacturing base. And the only way to maintain that is to increase military spending. But it's literally hollowing out all of its alliance structures. And we can just see this happening right before our eyes every day now. Now, what we need to do in this sort of second part of this rather long discussion that I'm having with you today is to discuss the power of the soft power, if you like, of the United States, which has managed to maintain a narrative for a very long time that has convinced a lot of people in Asia and in Europe and in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere that America was a benign power that really only wanted to bring security and safety and democracy to all of the people in all of the world. But we can see that that has not happened. The only thing that's happened is that the United States has been involved in 250 conflicts in 250 years. And that as little American blood as possible has been spilled to do that. And when there was some American blood spilled, real blood spilled, for example in Vietnam, they quickly turned tail and got out of there. And I think this is, Lee Kuan Yew said very, very aptly a long time ago that when push came to shove over Taiwan, no American lives were going to be lost over Taiwan because everybody knows that it's already recognized as part of China. So maintaining this fantasy about Taiwan independence is just ludicrous. And look, as emerging economies and developing economies come to this realization, and they all have, the non-aligned movement, the BRICS Plus, the SCO, the Belt and Road Initiative, as this brings increasing levels of prosperity and the ability to trade outside of the dollar, we start to see that the soft power, the attraction of the United States is slipping. And all one needs to do is have a look at any kind of homegrown feature film, documentary about America, and you can see the poverty in the streets, rising poverty levels, enormous personal debt problems, corporate debt problems. And so for many of you won't believe this, but you don't want to believe it, but that's what's happening. Go and visit America. Go and have a look at it. Go and see what's going on in the United States of America, and you will realize that its whole economy has been hollowed out. And this fallacy, this mirage of financial superpower is only purely related to the amount of dollars that are circulating in the world. And we can see that slowly but surely that's being chipped away at. And then as that diminishes, so does its power, its narrative power. And as Jean-Pierre Raffarin, the former Prime Minister of France, said, with planetization, the digital planetization, everybody can see what's going on in the world at every moment, just on their phones, from various sources. But the United States maintains an enormous power, narrative power, combined with its dollar hegemony, which still exists. It's still very powerful. It's not all going to collapse tomorrow, but it is going to definitely collapse at some point. And the November elections don't look good, but I think that an estimate would be something like 30% overvaluation of the dollar's real purchasing power, which would put the US economy basically in GDP terms at about the same size or just slightly smaller than China. And it would mean that Russia would have a much larger economy, so would India, and so would Brazil, and so would the African countries, and they'd start to look a whole lot more successful than they are now when you compare them in GDP terms. In PPP terms, ones that the World Bank and IMF use, well, we can see already that that's already happened. And so, look, declining living standards in all of the formerly advanced economies. One just needs to go and visit China to see what an advanced economy is starting to look like. The most fabulous infrastructure in the world, complete supply chains, robotics, digital, a complete university-educated class, enormous numbers of engineers, scientists produced every year, working hard to give benefit to the material well-being of their people. And that is also being seen as a model all around the world. The countries of the Middle East, the countries of Central Asia, the countries in Central Europe, the countries of North Africa and all of Africa and South America and Central America all see what's happened. And then they look at Japan and they think, well, no, we don't want to be like that. And then they're looking at Germany and they're saying, well, we don't want to be like that either. So this more balanced network of local currency trade with blockchain to secure the two ends, so you don't need to go through another third-party bank, which is basically what the US acts as a third-party middleman. It's basically taxing everybody. For every trade that you use in dollars, you may as well just pay US tax. And then the last part of the puzzle that all holds together, of course, is the standards. So standards, for example, like English language, or accounting laws, or financial regulations, or regulations on pharmaceuticals, or aircraft, all those sorts of standards. Everybody wants to meet the American standard, and this is a way of, these are really what the rules-based order are. When those rules, what are those rules? And those rules are all about standards related to services. And this is where America is still very strong. While its exports of manufactured goods have plummeted since World War II, its export of services has increased and is very, very large, more than $1 trillion a year. And so that's where it's really making its money. And that too is going to slowly disappear as new standards come, because the world's largest trading networks are through the Belt and Road, and through China is the largest partner for every country in the world, including the United States. And ASEAN, of course, is benefiting enormously from that, from the stability and from the trade and the trade networks. But nobody wants to see America collapse. That's not beneficial for anybody. What is needed, of course, is for the United States to stop building these circles, small circles into large circles kind of idea, to stop utilizing militarization as a way of pumping money into its economy and to keep its industrial base alive. What it needs to do is make structural adjustments at home, which are going to be painful. But it can be done, and it will be done in cooperation with all the other powers, the other poles. So Europe, Russia, India, Brazil, South America, Africa, these poles, China, these are the poles, the multipolar world, a multipolar peace. That's what the Americans need to really understand. And of course, it's very hard for the Americans, having been so powerful for so long. Now it's a sense of entitlement, of hubris, wrapped in a kind of mythology of enlightenment and so special privilege, exorbitant privilege, and the shining light on the hill and so forth, which is all wrapped in some kind of Protestant liberal ethic that's 300 years, almost 400 years old, and which Marx debunked a long, long time ago. So I think that, surplus to bust cycle that the Americans are in permanent cycle that they're in, and that they've somehow magically managed to avoid during the pandemic. So 2008, then the pandemic. This next number 3 is probably going to be the biggest of all. And the very last vestige of the kind of power arrangements that the Americans want, the unipolar power arrangement, is clearly being demonstrated by the idea that NATO is going to be a military alliance in the Pacific. And what's it for? It's not for the protection of the freedom and democracy of all of the countries along the Pacific. It's for the Americans to maintain the situation where they appropriate the security of all the other countries around the periphery of Eurasia and Africa and the Middle East, just as they've done since they superseded the British Empire, which also did that. But those times are ending. And so I'm just going to wrap up now. That's it for today. There's going to be more about NATO and also more about multipolar peace. Remember on Friday, I think we're going to have the second multipolar peace panel. I'm proud to be part of that with my friend Warwick Powell, and there's many others that you might know that have their own programs on YouTube. So I'll be looking out for that. I'll put a post in the bottom of this, and I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow.